Hey there and welcome back. Now, if you've been following along, you already know what no code is, how it works, what it can do, and you've probably watched me play about with it as well. But at the very start, I mentioned there is a fundamental mindset and skill set that if you want to build any no code app out there, you're going to have to pick it up. Now, I call this the pillars of no code. So let's dive in and see what I'm talking about. So there are four key pillars or key areas, key parts, key things that make up the bulk of no code knowledge. And if you can understand these, you're going to be able to put together anything that you like. But interestingly, these four pillars are kind of also what make up all modern software today. So even if you're a developer who can code, you're going to be following these pillars. Maybe you already have it in your head as a model. There's lots of different ways in programming that we talk about it. But we're going to approach it from a non-technical, no-code point of view. Now, any app that you're using probably follows these pillars. If you've used even Facebook, Uber, Twitter, something like that today, I can guarantee you it uses some or all of the pillars. So in this lesson, we'll have a bit of an overview about what the pillars are. And then in subsequent lessons, we're going to talk about each pillar. We're going to go into it in depth. We're going to go through examples. We're going to go through the detail and make sure that by the very end of this, you can take all those pillars and put them together into your very own app. Now, as I mentioned, these pillars cover software today and apps that are out there already. So before we get into the pillars, first we're going to take a look at how modern apps are built and what they consist of. So we're going to start with an introduction to app building. Now, bit of a disclaimer, I'm going to use apps as a general catch-all term for software. It's shorter to type, easier to say than software is. And maybe you're not building a mobile app, maybe you're not building a web app, but this is still going to be applicable to you. The only case this wouldn't be applicable to you, and even then, probably still a lot you can learn from it, is if you're trying to use a really niche builder. Take something like Shopify. Shopify is a no-code tool that lets you build e-commerce websites, and every single e-commerce website on there kind of follows the same pattern, which is you've got a homepage, and then you click into some product listings, and then you click into a specific product you want to buy. You buy it, you check out, you get it shipped, done. There's not much room for manoeuvring in there, and so as a result, this isn't going to be so applicable to there. But broadly, this is still going to teach you how the underlying Shopify websites work. It's going to teach you how really any app out there works. So if you're trying to build something niche like that, where there's already a tool that essentially lets you click and get it, then this is not going to be amazing, but probably still be worth you tuning in. So let's get stuck into them. Now, most software out there today can kind of fall into either a website or one of the buckets in the kind of following slides. And if we start with website, so I kind of define a website as clearly you go to it in a web browser, right? But versus a web app, it's a little bit thinner. And what I mean by that is usually it's just pure content, a little bit of functionality. So, if you take something like Forbes.com, for example, you're going to be able to browse through a bunch of different articles, you're going to be able to read stuff, you might be able to make a payment, you might be able to submit details through a contact form, but broadly, there's not that much that you can do with it. Now, these websites might be beautiful, there might be a ton of content on them, but generally, from a technical logic point of view, there's not a huge amount in them. And if you've got a website that's 10, 15 pages, great. If you've got a website that's maybe only 1 or 2 pages, we might tend to call that a landing page because it's really designed to just get someone landing on it, reading, and then taking some kind of action. Now, if that's the simple side of the web, let's talk about the complex side, web apps. So a web app to me is a website that you can log into and then take part in some sort of complex functionality. Now that could be accounting software, it could be order management software, or an easier example would just be something like Facebook. You think about it, yes, Facebook has got a website where it will tell you what Facebook is, but the majority of people go on Facebook, they log in, and then once they're in that kind of private, secure part of the website, you've got all this kind of complex functionality that you can play with and that you can use. So, you can post things, you can talk to people, you can upload pictures, etc. And so with that in mind, a web app tends to be characterized by interaction. And, this is very, very similar to a mobile app. Yes, Facebook has a mobile app, but for the purposes of understanding this, we're going to split them up. But let's have a look at that mobile app. So, first of all, and I might upset a few people here, but a mobile app within a definition of what we're looking at runs either on iPhone or Android. I know you get different types of phones out there that maybe run like BlackBerry, Microsoft, stuff like that. I'm probably slightly out of date with some of the names, But broadly, through this, we're going to talk about iPhone and Android because they are by far and away the most popular. And so a mobile app feels very, very similar to a web app, but it tends to have, number one, its own kind of custom looking interface that suits a phone. Even if it's got similarities, in terms of design, it's still going to be pretty unique to the phone. And number two, clearly mobile phones have a lot more functionality available to them than a laptop. You've got a camera, you've got Touch ID, you've got Bluetooth, all these different things that you can use. And so as a result, mobile apps can make use of those as well. But beyond that, they're still pretty similar to a web app, and we'll find out why in just a second. Now, before we go through the rest of this, I've already said that I am using the term apps to mean any kind of software. But as we go through the rest of these lessons, not just this lesson, but the subsequent lessons, I'm not going to make much distinction between mobile apps and web apps. So don't kind of look out for, well, is this about a mobile app or is it about a web app? You can assume that broadly they're the same thing. And that's because not only are they quite similar in terms of the way they work, but no-code tools, which support mobile and web, will tend to let you build both at the same time, and they'll tend to kind of take away a lot of the complexity so that you just focus on how it looks and how it works. And so as a result, as we go through, just assume, unless otherwise stated, that everything you're learning is broadly applicable to a mobile app, a web app, a website, a voice app, whatever else is out there. So to understand how apps work and how they kind of fit together, in software we've got this terminology called architecture. And architecture kind of refers to the structure of your app, the construction of it, and how it kind of all works together. And so that can include, how does a human make use of the app? Where's the data stored? How does the app provide its primary goals? And what I mean by primary goal is, how does Uber order a taxi? How does Facebook let you post an update? How does Airbnb let you book an apartment? What's the core thing that software is meant to do? And it can also cover other stuff like, what third-party services do you link to, etc. Now, the reason we use software architecture is because it's broadly kind of the same as the way we use architecture in the real world. In the real world, we're talking about generally houses, buildings, and in architects, as you can imagine, if they're going to work in a home, they're probably going to draw out, the boundary of the house, and then they're going to draw all the walls, and then they're maybe going to draw where the plumbing and the electricity should go, and then they're going to draw the doors, windows, etc. Beyond that, as you start to get into the detail, like where's the furniture going to go, what colour are the walls going to be, that's what we call interior design. And so what we kind of look at with interior design is we kind of compare that to the user interface. So if you think about, again, let's go back to that example of Facebook. You think about Facebook, and it's kind of, it's blue and it's white and it's got its logo and it's got a really distinctive way. When you're on Facebook, it looks like Facebook and not Airbnb or Google or some other website. That's what we would call user experience or user interface. We equate that to interior design. Architecture, on the other hand, is all about what's all the bits that make Facebook work other than the way it looks. What's the bits that go on under the hood that mean when you click something else happens? How is the data stored? How is that database structured for its users? And if that sounds a little bit overwhelming, don't worry, we'll get into that soon. But essentially, it's really good to just separate that. The user experience and the user interface is one thing, and the whole kind of architecture of how it all fits together, how it works, the broad brush strokes, that's something slightly different. And so just in the same way that a house in the real world has, generally 4 walls, a door, a few windows, a roof, they're kind of similar. In the same way, no-code apps all follow a very similar architectural structure. And actually, it's not just about no-code apps. Again, if you're a developer writing code, all modern software tends to follow this structure. And that structure is, you have a front end, a back end, a database, and you have a suite of APIs. The apps that you're using every single day are made up of these 4 parts. They may have a couple bits extra, they may chop and change bits, but this is broadly how every software developer is thinking about them. So let's get into what each of them are. Now, This is where we're going to start to use phrases that are going to be unfamiliar to you. So don't worry about that too much. We're going to use these again and again. So over time, you're going to start to really understand what they mean. But don't fret. As we go through it, things will start to click together. Things will start to make sense. So the front end is the part that the user sees. What you're looking at right now around me, on the slide, etc. This is the front end. It's the bit that you can see and that you can interact with. Previously we talked about interior design being user experience, user interface. Well, typically the front end is the user interface. It's the front part, it's the front of house, it's the bit that you see. You can think about it a little bit like a shop. If you go into an average shop, there's going to be the front where you can browse all of the different items for sale, and then there's going to be the back where everything's still in boxes and you've got a staff tea room and all that kind of thing, So we refer to how this looks as the user interface, but we then refer to the full experience that the user has. How does it feel? How do they interact with it? That is the user experience. And interestingly, an app can have multiple front ends. Take Facebook. It's got a mobile app. It's got a web app. It's got a website. It's okay to have multiple front ends, and you might have that on a tablet, you might have even a voice app, but you can generally just think of a front end as any way in which a user interacts with your app. Now, typically most apps are only going to have one front end, and that's okay. And you can kind of see a little bit of an example architecture diagram down here. We'll get into what the rest is in a minute, but broadly, you can have a couple of front ends, you can connect to a back end, the back end then connects to other parts. So let's learn a bit more about that. The back end is the invisible part of the app that controls how the app works. Again, in our shop analogy, the front might look beautiful, but if the staff aren't in the back unpacking the next lot of stock, if you don't have that, then nothing's going to happen in the front end. It's not going to look good. It's not going to have the items that you want, etc. So bringing that back to software, the back end essentially controls all of the interactions. So when a user clicks a button, what happens? When a user arrives to your site and signs up, what should happen? The back end controls all of this, and it controls what happens. It's the sort of brain, it's the decision making, it's the logic. And so your front ends, you could have one, you could have multiple, they'll all tend to connect into the same back end. And so if you think about it, when I said you can have multiple front ends, again, we'll go back to Facebook. If you take Facebook, if you go on the mobile app, if you go on the web app, any conversation you've had with people is still there. If I've said hello to someone on mobile, it's still going to show up in the web app. And that is because both of those front ends, where I can actually type in and speaking to someone, connects to the same back end, which is the part that sends the messages between people. That'll start to make more sense as we go through. And the back end, it's probably worth saying, especially if you're a very visual thinker, the back end can be the most complicated part. Thankfully, no-code tools make it pretty easy for you. So, database. Now, you might have heard this phrase before, but essentially your database is the part where all your data is kept. It's every bit of information that your app needs to retain is kept in the database. So, most obvious example is if you have an app that people have to log into, then you've got to store their username, their email, their password somewhere. That information has to be kept somewhere, and that is kept in the database. That's what we call the database. Again, going back to our shop example, it's like having a warehouse. In the back, it's where all the products are stored before they're moved. And I've put another example in here that I think just helps bring the point home a little bit. Take the note-taking app that you might have if you're using an Apple device or a MacBook, or if you're on Windows or something like that, you might have Notepad. Imagine a note-taking app where you write out a note and you save it somewhere. Well, when you save it in an app, that's getting stored in your database. And so the database is generally connected to the back end, because the back end will be making decisions. It'll be making decisions based on that data. Based on other decisions the back end's making, it's going to be putting information into that database, taking it out, whatever. So, these parts are all very, very intertwined. And then that, as you can see in the diagram, brings us on to APIs. So, an API is short for an application programming interface. Now, that is a mouthful, so we're going to try and avoid saying that ever again. But the idea is it's kind of like an easy way to use other pieces of software or other service providers. And the way I tend to think of it is, you know, if you go to another country today where you don't speak the language, it's going to be really, really hard to get around to communicate with people. Now, eventually, if you took a while and learnt that language, then you could eventually interact with people. You'd know the language, you'd be able to speak to them. But imagine you don't really want to take a year to learn a language or however long it takes. Well, this is where an API and software terms would come in, because imagine you went to a country and you had the instant ability to speak to anybody in your native language. It was just easy, it was instant. Whatever your native language is, everybody else in the world suddenly knows it and wants to communicate in it. Well, that's kind of how an API works. You know, rather than me, if I want to use somebody else's data or their app or their services from a kind of programming no code point of view, rather than me having to understand how that works, we have this common language that makes it really easy for me to just plug in, connect, grab their data, do whatever I like to do. And so yeah, the common use of APIs is to allow usually developers, although clearly we are visual developers or no coders, but usually the idea is to allow developers to quickly use information from a different service. Now, the best example I can give of this is Facebook and signing in with Facebook. You're probably starting to get a wee bit tired of Facebook, but it's a great example. And if you've been on any website ever that lets you log in, you've probably seen something that says sign in with Facebook, sign in with Google, maybe a few other providers. That's a great example of an API, because rather than me forcing my user on my app to create another email, another password to sign up, I can use an API from Facebook, and that means they can sign in with their Facebook account. Facebook has 1 or 2 billion users, which means you can generally be assured that most people on the web have a Facebook account to log in with. It's the same thing with Google. You know, people can log in with their Google account rather than have to reuse it. And what essentially happens there is I set up an API. So you would come to my front end, you'll log in, your details will go through to my back end. My back end will go, oh, it looks like this person's trying to log in with Facebook. Let's connect to Facebook's API to check that this Facebook account is legit. Is it the right username? Is it the right password? Facebook is going to come back and say yes or no. If they say yes, I'm going to say, brilliant, this person's allowed to log in, they're allowed to use my app, and it's good to go. APIs are used all day long, and sometimes we'll call them an integration, but they can be used to make a lot of things really easy. Like, you know, imagine sending an email message. A few years ago, that would be really, really difficult. You had to set up a specific server or computer to send emails. You had to configure all this stuff. It was a pain. Now you just have all these services where you just send them, you know, who's this email going to, what do I want to say, what's the subject line, and they'll take care of it through an API. Really, really powerful stuff. It can get technical. There's also completely non-technical ways to do it. I mentioned a tool earlier called Zapier. We're going to explore that a lot because it's kind of essentially a way to communicate with APIs without writing any code. Really powerful stuff. And so these 4 topics form the pillars of no code. And because of the pillars, I have slightly different phrases for them. So if we consider front-end, back-end, database and APIs to be programming type phrases, let's then assign them a no-code, non-technical, more understandable phrase. So a front-end we're going to call, you know, user interface and UX, or shortened UI and UX. A back-end we're going to call workflows. A database, we're going to call it a database, pretty easy. And APIs we're going to refer to as integrations. Now we'll change this language a little bit as we go through. You know, we might kind of change it around and use different phrases, but broadly, APIs are integrations, databases are databases, UI, UX, workflows. You can see it all there. So in the following lessons, we're going to learn a ton more about each of these. We're going to go through each of the 4 pillars in detail. We're going to start with databases because it's the most important part to get right, and it's where I see most people slip up. Then we're going to go into workflows, and from there we'll also look at integrations and UI/UX. So stay tuned and let's get stuck in.